Good afternoon. It is May 1st, 2020. Welcome to all my friends and our fellow Spectrum family members to another discussion of our markets and the future of your portfolio. We've titled this segment Coronavirus, Reopening the Economy and Restoring Your Portfolio. And what we're going to attempt to do today is give you a little look ahead. To do that, we got to start with a little bit of history. And I'm hoping that together we can bring some understanding to the current situation. And also, maybe you can forward this to some of the people that you know who might be involved in our political leadership at the local, state, and federal level, and help encourage them to push the reopening of our economy, particularly in states like Kentucky and the surrounding states that have little or no ill effects from coronavirus. First, I want to talk about the lockdown. You know, when we started discussing this virus back in late February, very little was known about it. And once we found out more information, it became obvious this was going to be an issue. How big an issue, no one knew. By the time you get to the models that are being used by our national command authorities, they were talking about up to 2.2 million American deaths. Those are serious numbers. Not as large as pandemics in the past that our country's faced over the last 150, 200 years, but certainly numbers that will get everybody's attention. That began the policy of social isolation and the rather immediate shutdown of our economy. And I want to talk about some of the ill effects that are caused by that type of policy. This was the most dramatic intervention in our economy, literally in the nation's history. And we can talk about the Great Depression, and obviously that had far worse economic effects, but we've never dealt with an event where we decided as a political class to shut down the economy at all levels. In fact, if you look at our nation's responses to past pandemics, our policy was clear, and I think it was clear-eyed. We quarantined the sick, we protected the vulnerable, and everybody else went to work and school. The sick in this case are those who developed coronavirus. The vulnerable in this particular virus, not all of them are the same, tends to be our older population and folks who have multiple morbidities. And all that means is they have a couple of things or more that are already wrong with them. In other words, this virus tends to affect the weak. The impact of the lockdown strategy, in my opinion, is that the cure to what ails our country has now already become worse than the disease. Now, I'll give you some examples of this in just a second. I do want to say that to kick this policy off, we decided that this was like World War II, and that was what was mentioned in multiple press conferences, both nationally and at the state and local levels. And you know, I knew people that served in World War II, and my parents were adults during World War II. Dad was born in 1913. I understand what World War II was about. I also understand that folks I knew who flew and fought on the ground in World War II wouldn't have compared this speed bump in the road of our lives and our economy and our investments with the incredible level of hardship that went on both pre our entry to World War II beginning in 1939 and after the war was over on both fronts in 1945. We can not really compare the deaths of 405,000 Americans who willingly gave up everything they had to protect our nation with this virus. And politicians who do try to compare it that way clearly have lost all perspective, and they've also lost my respect. Why did they compare it to World War II? I understand that maybe that was a phrase that was used to motivate people towards thinking more about doing what we should have been doing all along, especially during flu season, like wash your hands more. And if you got the sniffles or you're coughing, don't go to work. I totally understand that. But I think there were other reasons as well. And unfortunately, in my opinion, they boil down to simple and irrational politics, and they have greatly hampered our society. And let's talk about how some of that will play out. First, if you go back to the last recession, one that's called the Great Recession of 2008 to 2009, suicides during that period of time in America went up by 10,000. And there have been many studies done on this, but our suicide rate is directly correlated, that means it moves at the same rate, with our unemployment rate, which means at this time, since our unemployment rate is going to go up 5 times, we can expect an additional 50,000 American deaths. And I've read research reports by noted researchers, peer-reviewed, they're suggesting up to 200,000 additional Americans will commit suicide this year as a direct result of losing their employment, the hopelessness, the pervasive drug use, the significant spike we've seen in alcohol consumption, etc. The cure is worse than the disease. We can look at social isolation too. And this one hits a little closer home to me. A few weeks ago, 2 United States Air Force Academy senior cadets who had gone through 3.5 years of sometimes hell to get into the last semester of their senior year committed suicides in their rooms, where they were locked down and literally imprisoned and had meals brought to them. Social isolation kills. And who does it kill? It kills the most vulnerable among us. It kills our elderly. It kills our children. It works great hardships on those who are subject to domestic violence. And according to the CEO of the National Domestic Violence Hotline, their calls have spiked 24%. This is all data driven. So when folks say, look at the science, I really wish they would. Part of the science is a comparison between Sweden and Norway. Sweden has lost almost 2,000 more people than Norway has due to this pandemic, due to coronavirus. But Sweden never shut down their economy. Norway did. They locked it down tight like we have. And in doing so, they prevented what Sweden has gained. What Sweden has gained now is what's known as herd immunity. When you get a vaccine, the reason they give you the vaccine is so that your body can produce antibodies that fight the virus before it happens to you. Well, you don't have to be given a vaccine. There doesn't have to be a vaccine. There's no vaccine for SARS or MERS. They died out too quick to develop a vaccine. Your body creates its own vaccine, but it only does so after you're exposed. In 80% of the cases tested in New York City and in Los Angeles County, folks who have coronavirus antibodies never knew they had it. Probably like a lot of us will find in the years to come when the research is complete. And we find we do have antibodies if we get antibody tests. So Sweden has herd immunity. They're not really going to need to worry too much about round 2 or 3 like we have to worry every year with influenza. They're already prepared, and they did it without a vaccine. Herd immunity is important. Exposing those who are not threatened, our children, younger adults, is not going to lead to a fatal result unless the research shows they have several other issues. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has a report out that I thought was very interesting. You might be interested in too. High school students who miss 3 or more days of school per month have a dropout rate that's 7 times the normal dropout rate. And on average, they live 9 years less than their peers. You know, I'm very fortunate in that I've got a 6-year-old who I love a lot. Her name's Charlie, and Charlie's doing her school like the bigger kids are online. And I've sat down and done it with her. And I've talked to a lot of parents who are doing it with elementary and middle school and high school children. And particularly if you're a family where, for example, you have 2 first responders, maybe a nurse and a firefighter, like we have clients in that category, who are coming home and they're really tired because they're working. And then they've got to do 3 children's schoolwork. You're not going to get a good result. These policies of shutdown are stifling our children. They're costing them years of catch up. In the case of new graduates, for example, from college, they may cost them years to make up for the loss of employment opportunity over the next year or two. Just like we saw occur with grads in the 2008 to 9 time frame. In other words, it's not something you do for a long time. If you have to do it until the research is in, great. So why are we continuing it? You know, our national health authorities, Dr. Fauci and others, set these standards. They're the same people that didn't make sure we had the PPE in place that we needed and respirators and ventilators we needed when this pandemic occurred. They're the same folks that presented studies showing that in our country, 2.2 million Americans could die from this. As of today, we're about 63,000, and it is flat. If we peak at 68, which I think is kind of the expected number they're spitballing right now, that'll probably be a number that is a lot less than 2.2 million. And when we look at the number of traffic accident deaths in our country, 38,000 last year, and 4.4 million Americans severely injured in traffic accidents. I know we haven't stopped driving cars, but we stopped our economy in its tracks. I think I've probably said enough about this. I could go on literally, folks, for hours. I've got notes in preparation for this, but here's the conclusion. Stop the cure, especially in states like Kentucky, Governor Beshear. We're not an epicenter hotspot. We don't live on top of each other like they do in New York City. Stop your cure. A lot of us will peacefully protest, and unless I'm sick and I go out in public, where I always will maintain the 6-foot bubble, I won't be wearing a mask. I'm lucky because our firm was considered an essential worker, and we got to come to work. And adults in our country are intelligent enough to wash their hands a lot more, keep their sniffles at home and isolated, and maintain the 6-foot bubble. It's time for common sense to come back into play. The rush to the exit, this is the second part of my discussion, has already started. States have already started to reopen, some ahead of the recommendations of our national health policy officials. Most of those states, in fact all of them, are in areas like our own in Kentucky that were sparsely affected by this pandemic. And in fact, we could say we haven't been affected worse, as bad yet, and probably won't be, as we have in past pandemics. You know, the average common flu fatality rate in our country is generally somewhere between 30 and 70,000 Americans. We're likely to come to the top of that with coronavirus. And we can't say anymore it's all due to social distancing and literally making folks prisoners in their homes, because that's been refuted with the disparities between Sweden and Norway, and by the common sense of not having a cure that makes the disease look pretty easy, really. So the rush to the exits has started. On April 2nd, in written correspondence with our clients, we said that we projected that March 23rd would be the low in the coronavirus pandemic response. In fact, it was March 23rd. And I looked at these numbers this morning. Since March 23rd through the end of April, our clients' accounts after all costs are up 31.83%. The S&P 500 during that time also had a great return. It was 30.17%. April, in fact, is the best month of performance in our equity markets since 1974. Gilead announced that their remdesivir antiviral drug, appears to be highly effective in the treatment of coronavirus. That's the big news in the last couple of days, and it's helped the market rally a little bit, because what it means is we're going to have treatment options. But folks, there are many, many parallel tracks going on here, including simple plasma infusion for Americans that already have antibodies because either they got coronavirus, felt it, and recovered, which is the vast majority, or they never knew they had it, but they did. Their plasma is life-saving and can be used on average to inoculate 4 other Americans. Each American plasma infusion can do that. The Fed, at this point, in my opinion, is overly accommodative. Between the Fed, the Federal Reserve's response, and U.S. government through Congress and our president, we have tossed about $8 trillion into our economy, and it's getting used primarily by small businesses through the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, you've read about, and that we've sent you a lot of notices about, which sends money to business owners to pay their employees over a 2-month period. Since we started getting those funds in April, that means May to early mid-June, employee cost is covered. I would encourage any business owner of 500 and less employees to please look into that program and utilize it if there's any issue with maintaining your employment levels, because that will put us over the hump, I believe. By the time you get into mid to late May, we project that most states will have rushed to the exits from their lockdowns, driven by surrounding states like Tennessee, who was widely criticized by Kentucky's governor. In fact, we were told not to travel there. They have less coronavirus infections and significantly less deaths than Kentucky. I'd say it's safe to travel to. As people start feeling the heat politically for keeping their states locked down for no good reason and not giving their citizens, who are hardworking, intelligent folks, the ability to make the judgment about what they need to do to safeguard themselves, their families, and their employees, that heat will motivate them to move quickly, unless stubbornness overcomes it. Please recognize that folks at the top of the food chain at the National Institutes of Health and CDC, they're wonderful, but they're not perfect. And they may be a little stubborn because they're the same folks that said millions of us were going to die. Their models were wrong, and they've admitted almost as much. History is going to judge them accordingly. You don't shut down a country or its economy in a pandemic unless you want to induce a depression and produce an unwarranted political result. It's our belief that full portfolio recovery will occur during the third quarter of this year. When I say full recovery, I mean your valuations will approximate where they were in late February when this slide started. It's our belief that in the fourth quarter of this year, we're going to see an extremely stimulated equity market compounded with hundreds of thousands, maybe a million or more jobs returning from overseas, and in particular, returning from China. We've learned a lot during this pandemic. We've learned that some countries, particularly those that are totalitarian governments, socialist governments, or communist governments, and China is a blend of those two, do not trust their people, will not allow them free speech. Some of the same things we've actually seen our politicians in this country, Michigan and other places, threaten to our own citizens. Pandemics do not give our leaders the right to take away our constitutional rights. The fourth quarter is going to be, in our view, a very, very healthy quarter. I would expect a total return during that quarter of approximately 10% or more. When all is said and done and we look back on 2020 next year, a lot of lessons have been learned about how to deal with a pandemic and how not to deal with one. Hopefully, we do not repeat the mistakes of this occasion. I'm hoping we get some questions here from those who are online. Feel free to type them in and I'll be glad to answer them. So the impending recovery is driven by what I have called a stimulus tsunami, a flood of capital infusion to our nation's banking system, where we have a large portfolio element, and to the companies that make up this system, small businesses and large. It'll also be driven by the China and the USMCA trade agreements that were reached late last year and which will fully kick in June of this year. Further, those hundreds of factories moving back are going to bring tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs as our nation and its CEOs secure the lifelines we need in the manufacturing of our pharmaceuticals, in the manufacturing of the protective equipment our medical professionals utilize and have to operate under these conditions, and in the creation of vital strategic national interest goods and commodities that we also outsourced, much to our peril, with regimes who constantly lie to their people and to the world. There's an extremely high probability that the November 4th election will see the re-election of Donald J. Trump. President Trump has done a well above average or great job, you be the judge, of managing the coronavirus, and a masterful job of bringing our economy prior to the coronavirus event to the height of its performance by late February of this year. In another year or so, I suspect this will be seen as a speed bump. Remember, we were very frightened by SARS, MERS, Ebola, AIDS, HIV. We never shut our economies down. HIV and AIDS have killed over 15 to 20 million Americans. There's no vaccine. There are modalities for treatment. There's things we do to arrest it. There's no vaccine. But we don't close our economy and create conditions like the 50 to 200,000 extra suicides we'll see this year that are directly related in multiple highly regarded research studies about unemployment effects on suicide. I see we've got a question. What about the loss of dividends in some stocks? That's a great question. I always try to put myself in the other person's shoes. Most of the time when I'm doing that, I'm putting myself in your shoes. But in this case, I'll put myself in the shoes of a Fortune 500 chief executive officer and chief financial officer. CEOs and CFOs understand that maintaining the integrity, the vitality of their companies is critical to benefiting you, the shareholder, and that is their fiduciary duty. Doing that, and at the same time being a patriotic American and trying to maintain the employment of their employees means sometimes on a short-term basis, just as they did in the 2008 to 2009 recession and every other recession we've had in history, they may have to cut dividends for a short period of time. When their cash flow comes back, they generally reinstate those dividends, and they do so quickly. So I would not worry about a temporary loss of dividends. Again, going back to the numbers we looked at for April performance, that's the market anticipating what we're projecting, which is a full recovery and beyond. Remember this, it's very important. There has never been a time in our country's history that any pandemic, any recession, any depression, any war did not fail to correct itself and then see the market soar well above its higher limit prior to the fall. This one will be the same. Airline industry. You know, Delta is one that we added because I think Delta, of all the major domestic airlines, is the healthiest financially, has the best balance sheet, the best leadership, etc. And Delta was a position we began to build, probably going to buy more, after it had fallen well below what we felt it deserved to be priced at, given our time frame from recovery. The airlines are not going to go away. They are also a vitally strategic industry. They must be maintained, even if that occurs via subsidies from the government. The government has already authorized subsidies for our major airlines, and I suspect that they will be flying the same passenger loads in a year and a half, maybe a year, that they were flying pre-coronavirus. So airlines are going to be healthy. There's not going to be any kind of long-term impact. And the same thing applies to other companies that we recently acquired. All of these we've had large gains in, by the way. Marriott, one of the best run hotel chains ever in the country. Marriott has made us a lot of money recently, but their fall went well below fair market value simply because the market was extrapolating a very, very, very long-term lockdown, the literal house arrest that we've unconstitutionally been under. That's something that we think will also be resolved, as will the airline problem. Any other questions for me? All right. I want to say thank you for joining us. I also want to say we're going to conclude this Facebook Live video cast, but we're here and we're working for you. Feel free to call me if you have any investment questions, and we will handle whatever comes. I look forward to the future to do exactly what our economy, our markets, and our people have done in the past, and that is win. We're not in World War II. We're not even in Vietnam, the Gulf War, or the War on Terror. Comparing this to World War II is ludicrous. Allowing politicians to usurp our constitutional rights, to dictate what we do and when we do it, will lead to an eradication of our constitutional liberties if we, the people, don't insist they stop. One other question I want to address. When will Boeing improve? Boeing is going to improve as it has over the last month at a steady level. I'm not saying it's going to be quick back to the 360 to 400 level, but I suspect it'll be there in another year or so. Boeing's constrained by two things. One is the issues, again, related to locking down an economy and the individuals that are healthy in that economy that could work, go on business trips, or vacation with their families. And those issues are going to be resolved. As I said, we've got plenty of states already opening now, and the rush to the exits will increase as other governors realize they're going to be judged very critically for taking very low-risk states and shutting them down as if we live in New York City with 7 to 10 million people on top of each other. That's not our situation. Remember, in most of our states, we never remotely approached coronavirus capacity, and in fact, in some, never got a coronavirus patient who died. So we need to really start thinking about how we're using our resources. I see a comment from one of our clients, and that client is saying, thank you for always being a voice of reason. You're welcome. I've seen a lot, and I've studied a lot that I haven't seen during my lifetime, but I've seen a lot of different market environments. You know, I've always said that our nation's markets, very much like ourselves, are largely driven by fear and greed. And so when others are fearful, we should be greedy. And when they're greedy, we should be fearful. The fear will dissipate. It would help if our leaders' fear went away. And I'll give you an example of that. Our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, announced a few days ago that the House will not reconvene after their extremely long, month-long recess. Why? We've got folks at Kroger right now, and we got folks at Walmart. We got folks at our fire department and our police departments and our water companies and here and our banks. And they're working. They're working for the people that entrusted them with their lives and with their assets. Why are our politicians, who are now demanding that when we go out in public, we wear masks? Remember, that mask doesn't protect you unless it's an N95 correlated mask. It only protects you somewhat from others. But if you're willing to take the risk, just like I do when I skydive, just like I do when I fly an airplane, just like I do when I scuba dive, just like you do when you go out for a run and somebody may hit you on your bike. If you're willing to take the risk, that's your choice, and it's a God-given right. Our rights are called in the Constitution inerrant rights. Those are rights granted by God, not granted by government, and cannot be thwarted by government. So if you're in a state like Kentucky, our rights must come back, and they must come back quickly. Our people want to work. The healthy ones will decide themselves to go to work. They don't need an elected official to make that decision. Now, that may not be possible in the more urban areas, again, like New York City, LA, where they've got 14% of their population infected with coronavirus, according to a recent study that was done. But their fatality rate, based on that level, is down below 0.3%. Doesn't make any sense to shut even that economy down. But they're doing that. So I'm always going to be the voice of reason because I've studied economic history for my entire adult lifetime. It repeats itself. This will repeat itself too. Remain invested. If you can add assets, do so now. You will be handsomely rewarded, as many of our clients have been who did realize the full April return on large and small investments made at the 1st of April. And again, we're talking about 31.83% on average after cost for our clients. We're going to see outsized returns in the months ahead. And just as this thing fell fast, it's going to rise fast. Just as our economy abruptly skidded to a halt, we're going to see it reopen quickly. God bless you and your families. Thank you very much for your time. Bye.